The name that changed everything. The rain fell in sheets across the narrow alleyway behind the Golden Tiger restaurant, turning the concrete into mirrors that reflected the dim glow of distant streetlights. Kang Joon-ho stood beneath the awning, his black coat collecting droplets at the shoulders, his face as unreadable as it had been for the past 20 years of his life in the underworld of Seoul. He had come here for a meeting that never happened. His contact had failed to arrive, and now Joon-ho found himself alone in the kind of place he usually only visited when something needed to disappear. The irony was not lost on him. At 43 years old, he commanded an empire that stretched across 3 provinces, employed over 600 men, and controlled operations that legitimate businessmen only whispered about in private. He was known simply as the Quiet Storm because he never raised his voice, never showed anger, and yet somehow everyone who crossed him eventually found their world crumbling without understanding how or why. But tonight, standing in the rain, Joon-ho felt something he had not experienced in decades. He felt tired. It was in this state of unexpected weariness that he heard the sound. It was small, barely audible above the drumming of rain against metal awnings and trash bin lids. A whimper, human, young. He should have walked away. Every instinct developed over 2 decades of survival told him to return to his car, to let his driver take him back to the penthouse where silence and expensive whiskey waited. Whatever made that sound was not his concern. He had learned long ago that sentiment was a luxury men in his position could not afford. And yet his feet carried him toward the noise. Behind a stack of collapsed cardboard boxes, pressed against the cold brick wall of an abandoned building, sat a child. She could not have been more than 4 years old. Her hair was matted, her face streaked with grime and tears, and she wore a thin dress completely unsuitable for the autumn cold. One of her shoes was missing. She clutched a ragged stuffed rabbit to her chest, as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. When she saw him, she did not scream or run. She simply looked up with eyes that held no fear, only a kind of exhausted acceptance that made Joon-ho's chest tighten in a way he did not recognize. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice low and even. The child shook her head slowly. Then she spoke, and her words carried the simple, devastating honesty that only children possess. "Mama went to sleep and won't wake up. The neighbors said she's gone forever now. They said someone would come for me, but nobody came." Joon-ho was not a man who believed in fate or destiny. He believed in power, in strategy, in the cold mathematics of influence and control. But standing there in the rain, looking down at this small abandoned creature who had been waiting for someone who would never arrive, he felt something shift inside him. It was subtle, like the first crack in a dam that would eventually break. He removed his coat and wrapped it around her. The garment swallowed her entirely, leaving only her face visible. She did not flinch at his touch. "What is your name?" he asked. "Min-jae," she said. "Park Min-jae." "Min-jae," he repeated. "I am going to take you somewhere warm. Is that acceptable?" She considered this with the gravity of someone 3 times her age. Then she nodded. As Joon-ho lifted her into his arms, she wrapped her small hands around his neck and pressed her face against his shoulder. She was so light. How could something so small carry the weight of such loss? His driver, a man named Seok-jin, who had been with him for 15 years, showed no visible reaction when Joon-ho emerged from the alley carrying a child. This was part of why Seok-jin had survived so long in this line of work. He did not ask questions. He simply opened the door. In the warm interior of the car, with the heater running and the rain reduced to a muffled rhythm against the windows, Min-jae looked up at Joon-ho's face. She studied him with an intensity that made him unexpectedly uncomfortable. Then she said the word that would alter the course of his entire existence. "Baba." Joon-ho froze. "I am not your father." "I know," Min-jae said, "but you came when nobody else did, so you're Baba now." She said it with such simple certainty, such absolute conviction, that Joon-ho found he had no response. She laid her head against his chest, closed her eyes, and within minutes she was asleep. He sat there in silence, as Seokjin drove through the rain-soaked streets of Seoul, looking down at this child who had claimed him with a single word, and he realized with growing clarity that he had no idea what to do next. The weight of what he had built. The penthouse that served as Joon-ho's primary residence was not designed for children. Everything in it spoke of cold sophistication, black leather furniture, minimalist artwork, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glittering city below. There were no soft edges, no warm colors, no indication that laughter or playfulness had ever touched these rooms. He had his housekeeper prepare a guest room for Min-jae. The woman, who had worked for him for 8 years without once asking about his business, simply nodded and gathered blankets and pillows as if this were a perfectly normal occurrence. That night, after Min-jae had been bathed, fed, and put to bed in sheets far too large for her small body, Joon-ho sat in his study and began making calls. He learned that Min-jae's mother had died 3 days ago from an illness she could not afford to treat. There was no father on record. No family came forward to claim the child. She had been forgotten by everyone except the neighbors who had dropped her at a local shelter, which had apparently lost track of her within hours. She had wandered for nearly 2 days before Joon-ho found her in that alley. The logical thing to do was to contact child services, to transfer her to proper authorities, to let the system handle what the system was designed to handle. This was not his responsibility. He was not a good man. The things he had done to build his empire would fill volumes, and while he had always avoided unnecessary cruelty, he was not innocent. His hands were not clean. And yet, when he thought about making that call, about handing Min-jae over to strangers who would process her like paperwork and place her in a foster system that might or might not treat her with kindness, something inside him refused. He told himself it was temporary. He would care for her until a better option presented itself. That was all. But days turned into weeks, and weeks began to stretch toward a month, and every morning Min-jae would wake up and find him drinking tea at the kitchen table, and she would climb into the chair beside him and say, "Good morning, Baba," and the word would settle into his chest like something warm taking root. She asked for very little. She was quiet in the way that children who have learned early that silence is safer often are. But gradually, as she began to understand that she would not be sent away, small pieces of her true self emerged. She liked to draw, filling page after page with crayon images of flowers and rabbits and houses with smoke curling from chimneys. She had a laugh that sounded like bells. She talked to her stuffed rabbit as if it were a trusted advisor, explaining situations and asking for its opinion. And she attached herself to Joon-ho with a devotion that both terrified and humbled him. It was during the 5th week of Min-jae's presence in his life that the first real conflict arose. His second-in-command, a man named Choi Tae-sung, came to the penthouse for what was supposed to be a routine meeting about territorial disputes in the Incheon Port District. Min-jae was supposed to be in her room with the housekeeper, but she had wandered out looking for Joon-ho. She walked into his study just as Tae-sung was describing, in vivid detail, what should be done to a business owner who had refused to pay his debts. Joon-ho watched Min-jae's face as she stood in the doorway, half hidden behind the frame. He watched her eyes widen, not with understanding exactly, but with the instinctive recognition that what was being discussed was dark and frightening. "That is enough," Joon-ho said, cutting Tae-sung off mid-sentence. Tae-sung blinked. In 20 years, he had never been interrupted during a strategy discussion. "Sir, the meeting is over. We will continue this another time." He rose from his desk, walked to Min-jae, and lifted her into his arms. She pressed her face against his neck, and he could feel her trembling slightly. "Who is this child?" Tae-sung asked, his voice carrying a note of suspicion that Joon-ho did not miss. "She is under my protection," Joon-ho said. "That is all you need to know." After Tae-sung left, Joon-ho sat with Min-jae on the balcony, watching the city lights below. The autumn air was cold, but he had wrapped her in a blanket, and she sat on his lap with her stuffed rabbit, her earlier fear slowly fading. "Baba," she said, "is that man your friend?" Joon-ho considered the question. He works with me. He has scary eyes. Yes, Joon-ho admitted, he does. I don't like him. You do not have to. Min-jae was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Baba, your eyes aren't scary, they're just sad. Joon-ho felt something crack inside him. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but it was the same crack that had begun in the alley, and it was growing. Min-jae, he said slowly, do you know what I do for work? She shook her head. I run a business, he said, a very complicated business, and sometimes the things this business requires are not good things. She looked up at him with those clear, trusting eyes. Are you a bad person? It was the question he had never allowed himself to ask directly. He had justified, rationalized, compartmentalized. He had told himself that everyone made choices within the circumstances they were given, that he was no worse than the system that had created him, that power was neutral, and only its application could be judged. But looking at Min-jae, he found he could not lie. I have done bad things, he said, many of them. She nodded as if this made sense to her. Then she said, Mama did bad things sometimes too. She yelled at me when she was tired. She forgot to feed me sometimes, but she still loved me. And you came when nobody else did, so maybe you can do good things too. Joon-ho closed his eyes. The philosophy of a 4-year-old child should not have carried such weight, and yet it did. That night after Min-jae was asleep, Joon-ho sat in his study and looked at the papers on his desk. Financial reports from operations he oversaw, communications about arrangements that kept certain officials looking the other way, plans for expansion into territories where resistance would need to be handled. He thought about Min-jae growing up in this world. He thought about the man she would see him become if he continued on this path. He thought about the inevitable day when she would be old enough to understand exactly what her Baba really was. And he began to plan something he had never imagined planning, his exit. The price of leaving. Stepping away from an empire was not something that could be done quickly or without cost. Joon-ho understood this better than anyone. He had watched others try to leave the life, and the results had rarely been favorable. But Joon-ho had something most of them had not: patience, strategic intelligence, and leverage accumulated over 2 decades of careful observation. Over the following months, he began the process of disentangling himself from his organization. He transferred authority gradually, delegating more responsibility to trusted lieutenants, slowly removing himself from day-to-day operations. He liquidated certain assets and converted others into legitimate businesses that could function without his direct involvement. He also began building a new identity for himself and Min-jae, a quiet house in a coastal town south of Seoul, documents that would allow them to live ordinary lives, a story simple enough to be boring, a single father raising his daughter, working as a consultant for import-export businesses, nothing that would attract attention. But there were those who did not want him to leave. Tae-sung visited him one evening, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes sharp with calculation. There are rumors, Tae-sung said, that you are withdrawing from your responsibilities. I am restructuring, Joon-ho replied. It is time for the organization to evolve. Some interpret this as weakness. Some often misinterpret. Tae-sung glanced toward the hallway where Min-jae's room was located. This child has changed you, many have noticed. They wonder if your judgment has been compromised. Joon-ho stood slowly. He was not a physically imposing man, and he never used violence to make a point when silence would serve. But something in his bearing made Tae-sung take a half-step backward. I have given 23 years to this organization, Joon-ho said. I have made it what it is. I have protected it, grown it, and led it through challenges that would have destroyed lesser structures. And now I am choosing to step away. This is my right. Rights are negotiable in our world. So is loyalty, Joon-ho said. Remember who knows every secret, every arrangement, every vulnerability. I am not asking for permission, Tae-sung. I am informing you of a decision that has already been made. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Joon-ho had never operated through fear alone, but he understood its utility. He had spent decades building a network of information, favors, and mutual obligations that made him essentially untouchable. If anything happened to him or Min-jae, certain documents would reach certain people, and the entire empire would collapse within weeks. Tae-sung understood this. His jaw tightened, but he nodded. "And the child?" he asked. "The child is my family," Joon-ho said. "She is outside of all this. She will remain so." It was the first time he had used the word family. It felt strange on his tongue, but not wrong. After Tae-sung left, Joon-ho found Min-jae standing in the hallway in her pajamas, clutching her rabbit. "Was that the scary man again?" she asked. "Yes. Is he going away?" "Yes," Joon-ho said. "He will not come here anymore." Min-jae nodded, satisfied. Then she held up her arms, and he lifted her, and she wrapped herself around him with the absolute trust that still surprised him every time. "I had a bad dream," she said. "Can I sleep in your room tonight?" Joon-ho, who had never shared his space with anyone, who had maintained careful walls around every aspect of his personal life, found himself saying, "Yes, you can." The quiet house by the sea. The house was small by the standards of his former life, but it sat on a hillside overlooking the ocean, and in the mornings, sunlight poured through the windows and painted everything gold. There was a garden that Min-jae helped him tend, though her help mostly consisted of making mud pies and asking endless questions about why certain plants had certain colors. They had lived there for 6 months now. The transition had not been entirely smooth. There were nights when Joon-ho would wake suddenly, his body tensed for threats that no longer existed. There were moments when he reached for patterns of thought and behavior that had no place in this new life. And there were days when he wondered if he deserved any of this peace, or if he was merely borrowing time that would eventually need to be repaid. But then Min-jae would burst through the door with sand in her hair and shells in her pockets, demanding that he come see the tide pools, and the doubts would quiet. She was 5 now, and she had grown in ways that seemed impossible given how short the time had been. Her vocabulary had expanded dramatically. She had started attending a small local school where she was learning to read and write. She had made friends with the neighbor's daughter, a quiet girl named Hana who shared her love of drawing. And she still called him Baba. One afternoon, as they sat on the beach watching the sun sink toward the water, Min-jae leaned against him and said, "Baba, did you always live by the ocean?" "No," he said. "I grew up in the city, in a very different place than this." "Why did you leave?" Joon-ho considered how to answer. He had thought long about how much truth to give her as she grew older, how to explain his past without burdening her with it, how to be honest without destroying the image she had of him. "I left because I met someone who needed me to become better," he said finally, "and I could not become better in that old place." Min-jae nodded seriously. "Was it me?" "Yes, it was you." She smiled, a small, pleased expression that made her whole face brighten. "I'm glad you left." "So am I." She was quiet for a moment, drawing patterns in the sand with a stick. Then she said, "Baba, at school they talked about families. Mrs. Park asked everyone to draw their families. I drew you and me and Mr. Rabbit." "That sounds like a good drawing." "Mrs. Park asked if I had a mama too. I told her my first mama is sleeping forever, and now I just have you." Joon-ho felt the familiar ache that came whenever her mother was mentioned. He wished he could have done something sooner, found Min-jae earlier, changed circumstances that were unchangeable. "Does that make you sad?" he asked, "having just me?" Min-jae shook her head emphatically. "No, because you're enough, you're more than enough. Mrs. Park said families come in all shapes, and I said mine is shaped like Baba and me and the ocean and Mr. Rabbit, and she said that sounded wonderful." Joon-ho blinked against a sudden stinging in his eyes. This child, who had lost everything before he found her, who had every reason to be angry at the world, instead moved through life with a generosity of spirit that he could barely comprehend. "Min-jae," he said, "do you know why I chose to stay with you?" She looked up at him curiously. When you called me Baba that first night, he said, you gave me something I did not know I was missing. You gave me a reason to be something other than what I was. I stayed because you saw something in me that I could not see in myself. What did I see? I do not know exactly. Perhaps the person I could become, perhaps just someone who came when nobody else did. But whatever it was, I have spent every day since trying to be worthy of it. Minjai leaned her head against his arm. You're already worthy, Baba, you just didn't know it. They sat together as the sun completed its descent, painting the water in shades of orange and pink and gold. The evening air grew cool, and eventually Joon-ho rose and offered his hand to Minjai. Time to go home, she asked. Time to go home. She took his hand, and together they walked up the path toward the little house on the hillside. The lights were on inside, warm and welcoming, and the smell of the dinner he had prepared earlier drifted out through the open kitchen window. This was his life now. Not power, not influence, not the careful management of an empire built on questionable foundations. Just this house, this child, this simple daily rhythm of meals and school and stories before bed. It was not a life he had ever imagined for himself. It was not a life he had ever thought he deserved. And yet here it was. Here she was. This small, fierce, impossibly resilient girl who had looked at a stranger in a dark alley and decided he was her Baba, and in doing so had given him the one thing his previous life could never provide, a chance to start again. That night, after dinner and homework, and the nightly ritual of brushing teeth and choosing pajamas, Joon-ho tucked Minjai into bed and sat beside her as she clutched Mr. Rabbit and yawned. Baba, she said sleepily, tell me the story again, about the night you found me. He had told her this story many times now. She never tired of hearing it. It was raining, he began, a heavy autumn rain that made the streets shine like glass. I was standing under an awning, waiting, when I heard a small sound. A whimper, Minjai supplied. Yes, a whimper, and I followed it, even though I did not know why, and I found a very brave girl sitting behind some boxes. That was me. That was you, and even though you had been through something terrible, even though you were cold and tired and afraid, you looked at me without running away. Because I knew, she said, I knew you would keep me safe. How did you know? She smiled, her eyes already closing. Because you looked lonely too, and lonely people need families. Joon-ho sat with her until her breathing deepened into sleep. Then he bent and kissed her forehead, something he had never done in his previous life, something that felt as natural now as breathing. Thank you, he whispered, for seeing me, for choosing me, for giving me this life. She did not stir, already deep in whatever dreams children dream. He rose quietly and left her door slightly open, just as she liked it. In the kitchen, he made himself a cup of tea and stood by the window, looking out at the moonlit ocean. Somewhere far away, in the city he had left behind, his former organization continued its operations without him. T-Sung had taken over, and from what Joon-ho occasionally heard through carefully maintained channels, things were proceeding as expected. His exit had been clean, his leverage sufficient to ensure ongoing peace. But that world felt distant now, like a story from someone else's life. This was his story now. A small house by the sea, a little girl who called him Baba, tea in the evening and sand in his shoes, and the slow, quiet work of becoming someone worthy of love. It was not redemption exactly. He was not foolish enough to believe that good acts could simply erase the weight of past choices. But it was something. It was a beginning. It was proof that change was possible, that even someone who had spent decades in darkness could choose, one day, to walk toward light. And that would have to be enough. Outside, the waves continued their eternal rhythm against the shore. Inside, his daughter slept peacefully, trusting that he would be there when she woke. And Kang Joon-ho, former leader of one of Seoul's most powerful organizations, sat in his small kitchen and felt something he had thought lost forever. He felt grateful. He felt home.